On the evening of July 26, 1997, a sense of normalcy filled the modest home in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Inside, a group of friends and family sat together in the living room, eating pizza and chatting. Among them were James Corcoran, 30, his sister's fiancé, Robert Scott Turner, 32, and two close family friends, Timothy Bricker and Douglas Stillwell, both 30. For most people, it would have been an ordinary night of laughter and camaraderie, but for Joseph Edward Corcoran, everything was about to shatter. Joseph had grown up in a household where tensions simmered beneath the surface. Friends described him as reserved, a young man who often felt misunderstood or overshadowed by his brother James. His struggles with mental health began to show in his late teens, but like many in his situation, Joseph's paranoia and anger went untreated. Over the years, these emotions festered, feeding a growing sense of mistrust toward even those closest to him. Joseph, just 22 years old at the time, was in another room of the house. His mind was racing with paranoia, convinced that the men in the living room were mocking him, speaking ill of him behind his back. To those who knew him, Joseph had always been quiet, but beneath that surface was a deep well of anger, resentment, and mental instability. What would happen next would transform this quiet man into one of Indiana's most infamous killers. As the men sat on the couch, chatting about everyday topics, Joseph paced in another room, his paranoia reaching a fever pitch. He imagined whispers, insults he couldn't quite make out, but believed were aimed at him. The friendly laughter in the living room only fueled his delusions. In his mind, they weren't just mocking him, they were plotting against him. Driven by these consuming thoughts, Joseph made a decision that would change everything. Without a word, Joseph walked to a nearby room and retrieved a semi-automatic firearm. The house, so recently filled with the warmth of conversation, would become the site of an unspeakable crime in a matter of moments. With cold precision, Joseph returned to the living room and began shooting. Each of the four men was struck in the head, execution style, leaving them no chance to defend themselves. The scene was nothing short of horrific. 3 of the victims were found slumped on the couch, their lives extinguished in the very spot where they had been sharing an evening together. Joseph's brother, James, was among the first to fall, a tragic twist that underscored the deep fractures within the Corcoran family. The carnage left behind was so shocking that it would forever alter the lives of everyone connected to the victims and the killer alike. But Joseph didn't flee. He didn't try to hide or cover up his crime. Instead, he picked up the phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, Joseph calmly confessed to what he had done. "I just shot and killed my brother and 3 others," he said, his voice eerily detached. Even the responding officers, hardened by years of experience, were stunned by the brutality of the scene and Joseph's complete lack of emotion. As the investigation began, more chilling details emerged about Joseph's motives and mental state. He told police he believed the men had been ridiculing him, mocking him behind his back. This paranoia wasn't new. Those who knew Joseph described him as someone who struggled with feelings of mistrust and resentment for years. But no one could have imagined that these feelings would culminate in such a devastating act of violence. The Corcoran home became a crime scene that would haunt investigators and the local community for years to come. 4 lives were lost in a single night, and the story of what happened in that house would soon grip not just Fort Wayne, but the entire state of Indiana. Joseph's calm confession, his relationship to the victims, and the sheer coldness of the crime made him a symbol of a deeper, darker question. How does someone turn on their own family in such a brutal and calculated way? This question, and the quest for justice that followed, would dominate headlines, courtroom proceedings, and debates about mental illness, family, and the death penalty for decades to come. Police officers who entered the home described a scene they would never forget. The bodies of the 4 men were found exactly where they had been sitting moments before. 3 slumped on the couch, their expressions frozen in shock. Blood pooled on the carpet, and the silence of the house was deafening. For seasoned officers, it wasn't just the brutality of the crime that stood out, but the complete lack of remorse shown by Joseph, who waited calmly to confess. Joseph Corcoran's arrest marked the beginning of a chilling investigation that would reveal the complex layers of a man whose paranoia and resentment had reached a breaking point. When officers arrived at the scene, Joseph was waiting, eerily calm. His demeanor baffled law enforcement. This wasn't a frantic killer attempting to escape justice. He had confessed, surrendering himself without resistance. Yet, behind his blank expression, questions lingered. What could have driven a man to gun down his own brother and friends in such a calculated manner? As investigators pieced together the events leading up to the murders, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Joseph's paranoia had been simmering for years. Friends and family described him as someone who often felt betrayed or targeted by those around him. In the weeks before the murders, this paranoia had intensified, but no one could have imagined it would lead to such devastation. The victims, his brother James, soon-to-be brother-in-law Robert, and close friends Timothy and Douglas, had no warning of the storm brewing in Joseph's mind. The evidence at the scene was overwhelming. Ballistic tests confirmed that the semi-automatic firearm Joseph used was responsible for the murders. Forensic experts noted the precision with which the shots had been fired, suggesting a deliberate intent to kill. This wasn't an impulsive act of rage. It was a calculated execution. Each man was shot in the head, ensuring there would be no survivors. The chilling efficiency of the crime left even seasoned investigators shaken. When the case went to trial, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, family members, and local residents filled the seats, all eager to understand the man at the center of this tragedy. During the trial, the prosecution portrayed Joseph as a calculating killer, emphasizing how he retrieved the weapon, deliberately targeted each victim, and showed no remorse. In contrast, the defense called psychiatrists to the stand who described Joseph's paranoia as all-consuming, painting a picture of a man lost in delusions. One psychiatrist testified, "In Joseph's mind, those men weren't just mocking him, they were his enemies conspiring against him. He truly believed his life was in danger." But the prosecution countered, pointing out the precision of his actions, arguing, this wasn't the act of a man in chaos, it was a cold, deliberate execution. The prosecution wasted no time painting Joseph as a cold-blooded killer who had betrayed his own family in the most unimaginable way. They emphasized the premeditation involved, pointing to his decision to retrieve the weapon and target each victim methodically. The defense, however, had a different story to tell. They argued that Joseph was not a cold-hearted murderer, but a deeply troubled individual struggling with severe mental illness. Psychiatrists testified that Joseph exhibited clear signs of paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that distorted his perception of reality and fueled his belief that the victims were conspiring against him. The defense's strategy was not to deny Joseph's guilt, he had confessed after all, but to argue that his mental state rendered him incapable of fully understanding the gravity of his actions. The trial became a battle of narratives. Was Joseph a victim of his own mind, or was he fully aware of the horror he had inflicted? As witness after witness took the stand, the emotional toll of the murders became painfully clear. Family members of the victims described the profound loss they had experienced, struggling to reconcile their grief with the knowledge that the killer was one of their own. Perhaps the most gut-wrenching testimony came from Joseph's sister, Kelly Nieto, who had been living in the same house where the murders occurred. She described the bond she had shared with her brothers, James and Joseph, and the devastation of losing one to murder and the other to the justice system. Her words were a stark reminder of the far-reaching consequences of Joseph's actions, how a single act of violence could tear apart an entire family. The jury deliberated for hours, but the evidence and emotional testimony left little doubt about their decision. Joseph Corcoran was found guilty on 4 counts of murder. The weight of the verdict was palpable, but the trial wasn't over yet. The sentencing phase brought even more tension, as the prosecution pushed for the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. To secure a death sentence, the prosecution highlighted the calculated nature of the killings, the lack of remorse shown by Joseph, and the impact of the crime on the victims' families. The defense fought back, urging the jury to consider Joseph's mental illness as a mitigating factor. They argued that executing someone with severe schizophrenia would be a violation of basic human rights, an act of cruelty that ignored the complexities of his condition. But in the end, the jury sided with the prosecution. They found that the aggravating factors, multiple victims and the premeditated nature of the crime, outweighed any mitigating circumstances. Joseph Corcoran was sentenced to death, and the room fell silent as the judge delivered the sentence. It was a decision that would spark years of debate, not just about Joseph's guilt, but about the broader issues of mental health and the morality of capital punishment. As the execution date drew near, the emotional toll on Joseph Corcoran's family became increasingly evident. His sister, Kelly Ernst, who had suffered the unimaginable pain of losing both her brother James and her fiancé, Robert Turner, in the 1997 murders, struggled with conflicting emotions. Despite the profound grief she carried for decades, Kelly voiced her doubts about the execution, expressing that she didn't believe it would bring any meaningful resolution to the tragedy. On the night of December 18, 2024, the atmosphere at the Indiana State Prison was heavy with tension and somber anticipation. As the clock inched toward midnight, the weight of the moment was palpable inside the Indiana State Prison. Outside, a small group of protesters gathered, holding candles and signs calling for an end to the death penalty. Inside, in the sterile silence of the execution chamber, Joseph's supporters sat solemnly, knowing they were witnessing his final moments. The absence of the victims' families in the witness room spoke volumes. They had endured too much pain to relive it that night. As Joseph entered the chamber, he appeared calm, his face betraying no emotion. For the prison staff, it was a night they would not soon forget, the first execution in Indiana in over a decade. In the witness area, reserved for Corcoran's family and supporters, 4 individuals were present: his wife, Tahina Corcoran, her son, federal defense attorney Larry Comp, and a journalist. Noticeably absent were members of the victims' families, a stark reflection of the lasting wounds and divisions caused by the events of that night in 1997. As the final minutes approached, Joseph Corcoran was led into the execution chamber. Witnesses described him as calm and composed, his demeanor suggesting a man who had come to terms with his fate. When asked if he had any final words, his response was short and haunting. "Not really. Let's get this over with." At precisely 12:44 a.m., he was pronounced dead, marking Indiana's first execution in 15 years. The execution reignited fierce debates surrounding the death penalty, particularly in cases involving individuals with severe mental illnesses. The execution sparked heated discussions nationwide. Advocacy groups decried the decision to execute a man with paranoid schizophrenia, arguing that the justice system had failed to address the root causes of his crimes. Religious leaders joined the debate, calling the act a moral failure. Meanwhile, the victims' families faced mixed emotions. Some felt the execution was long overdue, a necessary end to the nightmare that began in 1997. Others, like Kelly Ernst, admitted that the execution brought no real closure. "Nothing can bring back what I've lost," she said, her voice heavy with grief. "It's just another chapter in this endless pain." Advocacy groups and religious leaders had long opposed Corcoran's execution, citing his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and questioning whether someone with such a condition should be subject to the ultimate punishment. Despite these appeals and the outcry from opponents of capital punishment, the state of Indiana moved forward, asserting that Corcoran's case had been carefully reviewed and upheld through every level of the judicial system. In the aftermath, the families of the victims were left to continue navigating their grief. While the execution served as the legal conclusion to a long and painful process, it offered little comfort to those who had lost so much. For Kelly Ernst and others affected by the tragedy, the events were a reminder of the complex and deeply personal nature of justice, punishment, and forgiveness, a burden they would carry long after the final chapter of this case had closed. Joseph Corcoran's execution was not just the end of a legal case, it marked the culmination of a tragedy that spanned decades, leaving deep scars on everyone involved. While his death brought finality for some, it also reignited important questions about justice, fairness, and the lingering pain of loss. For many, there is an undeniable irony in the fact that Corcoran lived for 27 years after he brutally took the lives of his victims. James Corcoran, Robert Turner, Timothy Bricker, and Douglas Stilwell were all cut down in their prime, robbed of the futures they might have built and the lives they might have lived. Yet, Joseph was afforded decades to appeal his sentence, experience life on death row, and, for better or worse, exist in a way his victims never could. How does one reconcile that imbalance? Is it fair that a man who showed no mercy to his own brother and closest friends was allowed to live longer than some of his victims had even been alive? This disparity raises difficult questions about the death penalty and the justice system as a whole. Some argue that the years Corcoran spent on death row, in isolation and facing his eventual fate, were a punishment far greater than death itself. Others feel those years were undeserved, a mockery of the lives he took in a single horrifying moment. What do you think? Should the legal process for executions be streamlined to ensure swifter justice? Or are the decades-long appeals a necessary safeguard in a system where mistakes can mean life or death? It's also impossible to overlook the emotional toll this case took on the families of the victims. For them, the tragedy didn't end with the murders or even with the sentencing. They endured years of hearings, appeals, and reminders of the horror that took their loved ones away. Joseph's sister, Kelly Ernst, who lost both her brother and her fiancé that night, faced a grief that few could imagine. Her life was forever altered by the events of July 26, 1997, and the knowledge that the person responsible was her own flesh and blood only added to her anguish. While Kelly publicly expressed doubts about the value of Joseph's execution, her pain was unmistakable. For her and others like her, there are no easy answers. Can the execution of a killer truly bring closure to a family, or does it simply open old wounds? The answer may vary for everyone, but it's a question worth asking. And then there are the broader debates this case brings to light. Joseph Corcoran was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that undoubtedly played a role in the paranoia and delusions that led to his crimes. Should his mental illness have spared him the death penalty? Advocates for mental health reform argue that executing someone who suffers from a severe psychiatric disorder is a failure of the system, an act of punishment rather than rehabilitation. On the other hand, many argue that mental illness does not excuse cold-blooded murder, especially when the crimes are as calculated and deliberate as Corcoran's. What are your thoughts? Should mental illness serve as a mitigating factor in cases like this, or should the severity of the crime outweigh any personal circumstances? Do you believe justice was truly served with Joseph Corcoran's execution? Or does his case highlight flaws in our justice system that still need to be addressed? As we reflect on the lives lost, it's important to remember the victims. James Corcoran, a brother taken far too soon. Robert Turner, who was on the brink of a new chapter in life with his fiancée. Timothy Bricker and Douglas Stillwell, who were caught in the crossfire of paranoia and violence. Their families continue to live with the loss of these bright, vibrant individuals who never got the chance to grow old, see their dreams fulfilled, or create new memories with their loved ones. Joseph Corcoran's story is one of tragedy on all fronts, one that leaves us grappling with tough questions about accountability, fairness, and the human cost of crime. But now we want to hear from you. Do you believe justice was served, or do you feel this case reflects deeper issues in our justice system? How do we balance compassion for mental illness with the need for accountability? And, most importantly, how do we honor the victims while grappling with the difficult questions their deaths leave behind? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in this ongoing conversation.